Anti-war activist Tariq Ali critiques America's military occupation of Iraq in his latest work, Bush in Babylon. This talk from Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore lasts an hour, 15 minutes.
Good evening and welcome, everybody. We are delighted to have Tariq Ali once again with us this evening. Tariq, as you know, is known to all of us in many garbs: author, speaker, public intellectual, playwright, and filmmaker. But above all, he has been a rigorous dissenter, consistently speaking truths to powers. Born in Lahore, he attended Catholic school and then moved to Oxford in the early 1960s, when his opposition to the military dictatorship in Pakistan forced him to flee. While studying politics, philosophy, and economics at Oxford, he became involved in socialist student organizations and soon emerged as a key figure in what was dubbed the political underground. He debated with Henry Kissinger, protested effectively against the Vietnam War, led the infamous march on the American Embassy in London in 1968, and edited the revolutionary paper, The Black Dwarf. Tariq founded an independent television production company in the 1980s and collaborated on plays with Howard Benton and films with Derek Yarman. A constant and prolific writer and speaker, Tariq is also an editor and board member of the New Left Review, a regular contributor to The Guardian and London Review of Books, and is currently working on an opera about Ayatollah Khomeini. He has written over a dozen books on history and politics, including The Islamic Quartet, and 4 award-winning historical novels that explore the encounter between the Christian West and the world of Islam. His previous book, The Clash of Fundamentalisms, is a broad analysis of the historical and religious roots of the 9/11 attacks, the war on terror, and the collision between rigid Islamic fundamentalism and persistent American aggrandizement. In 2003, Tariq helped to organize the February 15th anti-war rally in London, which attracted an audience of over 1 million. He is currently launching simultaneous international editions of Bush in Babylon, his new work, from which he will be talking to us today. I now present Tariq Ali for you.
When the events of 9/11 took place, there were 2 possible solutions. Some of us argued that the only way to deal with organizations like Al-Qaeda was not militarily but politically, that if attempts were made to deal with them militarily by invading countries and occupying them, terrorism would actually increase. We warned that the occupation of Afghanistan would not lead to the dismantling of Al-Qaeda. And when people asked what the solution was, I remember arguing with members of people close to the Bush administration, pundits associated with it, and we said the solution has to be political, and this solution has to entail solving 2 key problems in the Arab East. One, the continuing sore of Palestine, the continuing occupation of Palestine by the Israelis, and putting massive pressure on the Israelis to pull out of the occupied territories back to the borders of 67, and the emergence of a Palestinian state with continuous borders, independent and free, and not an Israeli protectorate. The second demand we made was that the sanctions against Iraq, which had crippled that country, led to the loss of 500,000 children and many, many more adults. Over the previous 12 years, the continuous weekly bombing raids carried out on Iraq by the Americans and the British with the backing of the United Nations had to stop. These 2 problems, if solved, would stop the flow of young people in the Arab world, educated people, professional people, to organizations like Al-Qaeda. There was really no other serious solution. Instead, the US administration decided to do the exact opposite. They invaded Afghanistan, occupied it, Occupying these countries is not a problem. If you're the world's largest military power, you can do it. It's what you do afterwards and what happens in these countries afterwards that matters. And in Afghanistan, the situation is a complete mess to this day. Some of you will recall that at the time of the Afghanistan war, the United States, or the ideologues of the United States, more or less argued that this was a war for women's liberation. It probably, if that had been the case, it would have been the first time in the history of the world that an imperial power has launched a war in favor of women's liberation. We had Laura Bush and Cherie Blair, the wife of the British Prime Minister, appearing on television, tete-a-tetes and radio talks and pointing out the condition of women in Afghanistan. Well, we didn't need to be reminded of this. We knew what the condition of Afghanistan was, both of women and, of course, of male citizens for many years. In the years in which the United States was collaborating with the organizations which were creating these conditions in that particular country. So it was not exactly new to us. But the notion that the war was fought to bring human rights is just a joke. Look at Afghanistan today. I mean, if you barely read reports of it, because it's such a total disaster. The writ of the guy imposed on Afghanistan, Hamid Karzai, doesn't extend beyond Kabul, as we warned. He is not guarded by any Afghan soldiers at all. US Marines have to guard him permanently, which doesn't speak too well of his support in the country. If you can't find any, if he doesn't trust any Afghans. So then, having done that, which incidentally, as you all know, failed to end the organization known as Al-Qaeda, then the administration began seriously to plan the invasion of Iraq. Now, the reasons they gave for the invasion of Iraq were false. The whole world now knows it. They lied. They said the key reason for invading this regime was that it possessed weapons of mass destruction. Bush said this about 20 times in the run-up to the war, which I document in my book, Bush in Babylon. Tony Blair, his fellow conspirator in this war, said weapons of mass destruction which could be unleashed and reach London within 45 minutes. Lie. Total and complete lie. The politicians lied to their citizens in order to get their citizens ready for war. And this created a deep division in these societies, a political division in these societies, which was very unusual. In Britain in particular, and to a lesser extent in the United States, leading military people were not in favor of this adventure. They came out and said so. In Britain, you had a strange experience, because it's a very secretive society, where the former head of the Joint Intelligence Committee, a former national security advisor to Blair, a senior intelligence guy called Sir Roderick Braithwaite, wrote a public letter to the Financial Times after the occupation of Baghdad, in which he made a ferocious attack on Blair and what had been done in the name of this war. So it's not that the division was the usual division of small groups on the left opposed to the mighty powers that be. These divisions went very deep in societies, and they went very deep in Europe as well. The scale and size of the demonstrations was phenomenal. 3 million people in Rome, just one city of Europe. About between 10 and 15 million who marched all over the world. That indicated not that there was a massive radicalization taking place, but that people were becoming extremely nervous of a big power which was out of control, which was now the only single empire in the world, and which believed it could dominate the world at will when it wanted to. So what were the reasons for the invasion of Iraq? What were the real reasons? If the weapons of mass destruction were false, as they patently were, in fact, in reality, the only reason they could go into Iraq was that Iraq did not have any weapons of mass destruction. If it had, they wouldn't have invaded it. They knew it was a weak army. They knew it was an army which wouldn't be able to resist, and they knew that the army had an armory which had been depleted by years of sanctions. That's the only sort of serious effect the sanctions had, if you like. The rest was just a disaster for the population. So they knew all this when they went. So why take Iraq? I think essentially for the following reasons. I don't think the principal reason for taking Iraq was oil, incidentally. That's always a reason when anything happens in that part of the world, because it has the cheapest available energy sources in the world. It's not that other parts don't have oil, this is the cheapest oil to produce. And so billions are spent every year by the United States in shoring up what is known euphemistically as the security of that region, i.e. keeping large numbers of regimes in power which are conducive to Western interests. If it had just been oil, there were other ways they could have got the oil. I mean, they could have, as they've done in the past, in the 70s and 80s, done a deal with the regime. In fact, even during the sanctions period, we now know that the United States were using decoy companies elsewhere in the world to buy Iraqi oil, at the same time as officially they had imposed sanctions on it. So it's not the case that the oil was unobtainable. I think the principal reason for the occupation was a demonstration of imperial power. Not simply to the Arab world, which didn't need such a demonstration, it after all is aware of it. It was a demonstration of imperial power to the world at large, to the Europeans, to the Far Eastern states, saying this is what we are. And the reason for this demonstration of military power was essentially to make up for the growing economic weakness of the empire. That the fear of the senior ideologues in the Bush administration, and before that in the Clinton administration, there is a much greater continuity between these two than is imagined. Many of the things incidentally being done by the Bush administration today were pioneered by the Clinton administration, getting the country ready for war, moving in and sending US troops to create new bases, expanding NATO into Eastern Europe, imposing restrictions on civil rights for certain groups coming into the country. All that happened during the Clinton administration. The Bush people have taken it further. But there is not such a big discontinuity as people seem to imagine. The feeling of discontinuity comes from the rhetoric used by the Bush administration, which frightens many people, but it is, on one level, it has to be said, more straightforward. It does say, I mean, they do say what they're doing and why they're doing it, and it is frightening, but it is real. And better to have it put straight than disguised and masked by phrases like humanitarian intervention, etc. And it's not the first time that great powers have behaved in this way, either the United States or before it, the British. Often, in order to show the rest of the world who was the dominant power, they did things which didn't make rational sense. I mean, if you look, or were immoral. I mean, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki after the Second War, or just at the conclusion of the Second World War, was that a military necessity to go and bomb, destroy 2 Japanese cities and kill hundreds of thousands of civilians and leave your mark on large parts of that country to win the war? No one believes that. It was done essentially to show the rising enemy, as they saw it, the Soviet Union, the big liberation movements in China, in Vietnam, in Indonesia, in Korea. This is what we are capable of doing, as a warning. It was a very expensive warning for the Japanese, but it was a warning to the rest of the world. The Japanese were virtually a defeated country already. Some of their people were already sending feelers for surrender. So it's not the case that this was necessary. And in the same way, the occupation of Iraq today is a warning to the rest of the world by an empire which is disproportionate. It is militarily very strong, but economically it's much weaker than it used to be. And it sees now, in a world where capitalism exists all over the world, rivals coming up, rival economies flourishing, and it thinks ahead. Don't be deceived by the fact that you have a particularly intellectually challenged president today to imagine that the people behind him are stupid. They are not. They think, they plan, they discuss with each other, and sometimes it's much better in the interests of an empire to have a figurehead president, because then if you like, the capitalist Politburo behind it can actually impose its will. Whereas if you have a president who's quite dominant and strong-willed, it reduces the power of people behind him. The two presidents you've had who've gone on the offensive, I mean, the biggest triumph of this country, if you look at it in that way, was scored under Reagan. Big offensive against the evil empire, as he called it, upping the military threats, the military encirclement, forcing the Russians to spend stupidly, a massive amount of money on military expenditure, provoking them to enter into Afghanistan, so they imploded. But it happened under Reagan. And under Bush, his administration has gone on the offensive, and they've gone on the offensive quite openly. And this is a message to the world. And that is why it was understood as such. The dissensions and disagreements that rose within the European Union were precisely because they knew what was being done. The Chinese didn't react that strongly, but they knew exactly what was being done. And in this situation, the actual suffering of the Iraqi people is not dissimilar in that sense. It's not reached that stage of the Japanese at the end of the Second World War. If you look at the occupation of Iraq today, what is going on? They assumed they would be able to pull it off without too many problems. And the reason they assumed that was because people told them that they would be welcomed with flowers and sweets. This particular university has some responsibility in this, the academic side of it, since it produced both Paul Wolfowitz and Fuad Ajmi, leading militants in the struggle for the empire. And these people were pretty determined to push it through, as was another Iraqi collaborator, Kenan Makia, who had their own agenda, but were totally isolated from the people of Iraq. And it's not a question that the people of Iraq loved their leader. If that had been the case, you would have had a total resistance from the beginning. That wasn't the case. But Iraq is a country with its own history, with a level of national consciousness and with a historical memory. And this is a country which has fought the British for 3 decades, 20s, 30s, or 4 decades, 20s, 30s, 40s, and a large chunk of the 50s, and then got rid of the British presence in Iraq and of the quislings the British had set up there. The difference between the British occupation of Iraq and the American occupation of Iraq is this, that the British, because they were a traditional colonial power, had a lot of experience in running empires, in winning over consent of a section of the population to run the empire. Of course, they didn't last that long in Iraq. 30 years is not very long in the history of empires. But the British created an indigenous social layer in Iraq on which they could rest for 30 years. This social layer existed on 2 levels. In the countryside, all the tribal leaders were made into landlords, given large amounts of land and made into landlords, so they had a stake in the colonial regime. In the towns, some merchant families were lifted out of the bazaar and given enormous privileges. And a British intelligence team which went to visit Iraq in the late 40s produced a very interesting report, which is now public. They said what we have succeeded in doing in Iraq is producing an oligarchy of racketeers. But this was an oligarchy of Iraqi racketeers. And so they were provided with some social layer in that country on which to rest. The current occupation is essentially providing an oligarchy of American racketeers. American companies are being taken in there to run Iraq. Everything is being privatized as part of the neoliberal economic agenda. That's the difference with the past. That's the difference. That what the United States is doing, it is doing in an epoch of neoliberal economics and this particular form of capitalism with which they try to dominate the world. That is what they're doing. This is not the New Deal. The New Deal confronted an enemy in the shape of communism. So they permitted, encouraged social democratic reforms, put money in to build infrastructures in Japan and Germany to revive the economy, reduce Britain to the level of a supplicant. They had done that already during the war through Lend-Lease. And once they were sure that it was done, then they helped to rebuild the capitalist world, because the big enemy that confronted them was communism. But today, no such enemy exists. Nothing that exists offers a superior social vision, economic vision to capital. That's their advantage. And in this, they can do what they like. So you go in like a steamroller. And that's essentially what's happening in Iraq today, with the plans to privatize the oil industry, with the plans already in motion to privatize everything else, and to do it through foreign companies. It's interesting that Bush referred to the Philippines model as a useful model for Iraq, because it shows a total ignorance. No one's educated him on what happened in the Philippines when they occupied it 100 years ago today, 102 years ago. There was a big resistance in the Philippines. 30,000 American soldiers, and in those days they were all white, died in the Philippines. Some of the leading poets and intellectuals of the Philippines were executed for resisting the American occupation. And precisely it ended up in creating a Filipino oligarchy, which oppressed the people of those islands for a long, long time to come, and wasn't got rid of, and still isn't been totally got rid of. It's hardly a model, what was done in the Philippines for Iraq. So what is happening in Iraq today? Essentially, contrary to what the administration believed and the advice given to them by their Iraqi collaborators, there has been a resistance on two levels from the very beginning. A passive resistance on the part of the bulk of the population, and an active military resistance on the part of different groups and organizations, including but not exclusively remnants of the old regime. And one reason for their resistance of the remnants is that the United States did something in Iraq which, from their point of view, was totally stupid. They disbanded the Iraqi army, stopped paying 300,000 soldiers their wages. These are trained people. They knew where the arms were, and many of them, and now decentralized without work, started the resistance in different parts of the country. This is something, incidentally, which the United States did not do in Italy, Germany, or Japan, where by and large a bulk of the old state apparatus was incorporated into the structures of the occupation, then built up again to take over those countries. The top people were removed, except in Japan, where the emperor was kept on as a symbol of stability against a rising labor movement. But by and large, in the other parts, in Germany and Italy, they removed the people at the top, but people on the middle levels were all incorporated. Italian towns were packed with fascists in the administration. For many, many years, this was the basis of the Christian democracy in Italy for a long time to come. In Iraq, they didn't do that. I mean, from their point of view, it was very foolish. because a chunk of that army could, if they kept it on the payroll, would probably have worked for them. Of course, I'm not sure, but probably would have done it just for material reasons. But they didn't do that. They thought they could destroy the Iraqi state just like that, and they did, and there's nothing in its place. That is why the resistance has grown. Many Western journalists have reported that lots of ordinary Iraqis come and say to them, after the first Gulf War, Saddam Hussein had water, electricity running within 2 weeks, because he had a state to do it with. If you destroy the state, if you put nothing in its place except a very thin layer of collaborators, it's impossible to get the situation right or even return that country to a semblance of normality. They haven't been able to do that. And so the resistance is increasing every single day. The claims of the resistance are true. They're not exaggerating. They are saying, we're going to make sure that there are casualties of occupying soldiers every single day. One feels incredibly sorry for the poor American soldiers who've been sent there by the politicians to die. Why should they be there? And when American soldiers speak, they speak up courageously. It's been reported in the New York Times and occasionally on television. And what do they say? Look at there's a New York Times issue last week, a soldier back on furlough. We were misled. We were told we were going there as liberators. The people hate us. This is what was so elementary that for them not to recognize it is just staggering. You know, it's not a very surprising thing. It doesn't require too much intelligence to just recognize that an imperial occupation of a country is not a popular thing for the people of that country. Think about it. They don't like to be occupied. It's not a big surprise, especially when the occupation comes totally complete with a neoliberal economic apparatus, so you can't deliver anything to the people anyway. In this situation, all you have is a resistance, and this resistance is spreading. At first, Dick Cheney said, oh, it's totally tiny pockets, we will, clear it out in a few months, there's no problems at all, the media is exaggerating. Well, is it? 7 months later, where are we? The resistance is growing, and the only reason the armed resistance can prevail is because of the support that exists for it in the population at large. No one is naming names. Very few people are betraying the resistance. Without that, it couldn't exist, because it's a country where people know what's going on. And this resistance will continue. So you now have a dual occupation in the Middle East. You have the occupation of Iraq, and you have the occupation of Palestine. And this will create mayhem in the years to come, unless it's stopped. And the only people who can stop it are people who are resisting, and they resist in their own ways, but people in the United States who've got to take on the politicians. The resistance has already forced politicians to rethink in a tiny way. I'm prepared, one can't prove this, but if there had been no resistance in Iraq, if they had had it all their own way, I don't think any democratic politician would have opened his or her mouth. The only reason they're speaking up a tiny bit is because of the resistance. It's not going well. And it won't go well, and they have to speak up even more. I remember in the days of the Vietnam War, you had 4 or 5 senators, Wayne Morse, Fulbright, etc., who were constantly putting the administration under attack. Now there seems to be no one. Even the ones who speak up do it in a completely pathetic fashion, instead of taking on the lies systematically and taking on the administration. These sort of politicians seem to have disappeared. They don't seem to exist, so the citizens of the United States have to do some of this themselves. They can't remain passive. And I always tell people in Europe that there is opposition to this war in America, in the United States. We've seen it on the streets. It's not organized, it's not consistent, but it's there. People are nervous. People know that they were lied to, and they've been led into this trap. And it's a classic first stage of an armed resistance to occupation that you're seeing in Iraq. It's no different from Vietnam, no different from Algeria. That's how they start. It's much more advanced than I thought it would be. I thought it would take at least 6 months for the resistance to get going. Instead, it's happened very quickly. So what are the options for them? And incidentally, the one argument used which really makes me angry is when the apologists for the occupation, including professors employed by American universities, say the real problem in Iraq is the people. Excuse me, you say? They say, repeat it. The problem is that these people were under a dictatorship for so long that they've become sick. That's why they're not seeing that what we're doing for them is actually a liberation. There are people saying this. And this talk is widespread in official circles in the United States. Kenan Makia, one of the guys writing the new constitution of Iraq in total isolation from the people of Iraq, said this on NPR a few weeks ago. The people of Iraq are traumatized. Bloody right they are. They're traumatized by being occupied. That's what's traumatizing them. They have their own ways of resisting Saddam Hussein. The notion that the people of Iraq were passive, the sanctions made them more dependent on the regime, that's true. But there was widespread criticism of the regime. Lots of things going on underground, culturally even. It's not the case that it had a total grip. The time the regime was at its most repressive was in the late 70s and 80s, when it was a close ally of the West, and Donald Rumsfeld went a-calling on Saddam Hussein to try and win some contract for his company. That's when the regime was at its most repressive. It was at its most repressive when it was unleashed against Iran to try and defeat the Iranians after the United States lost control of that country. That's when Saddam was at its most repressive. That's when he was being armed by the West. But this repression, everyone knows it, over the last 10 years has been completely on the decline. So the people, far from being traumatized, knew what was coming with this occupation. They were prepared for it, and they didn't welcome it. The only images that exist of the so-called liberation have had to be manufactured. The tearing down of the statue, carried out by 200 paid people, paid by the United States to do it. In a city of millions, 200 people? And this is meant to be a repeat of the Berlin Wall? And this image then was played. They don't use it now because everyone's seen what it was, a big square, let's say the size of this room, and in a tiny corner a few people are just getting to pull the statue, which they can't, so an American machinery and equipment has to come to take it down. And this image was used as an image of liberation. Or the sort of atrocious way in which they played up the Jessica Lynch business. How she was, rescued, when actually she was rescued by Iraqis who helped her because she was injured in a car accident. And these lies that are being told can't be challenged on the same level because no one can compete with that particular power the major media channels have. I mean, if watching the United States media is really a culture shock if you come from Europe. It really is. I mean, the main networks, I don't even talk about Fox TV, that's just a joke. Though a pretty awful one. But if you look at the main networks, the news reports on them are often no different from propaganda. What is known as propaganda. There's very little objective reporting going on. This recent upsurge in Karbala, where US soldiers had to go and fight some of the Shiite clerics, big enemies of Saddam Hussein, the report on the networks was atrocious, and actually the journalists had to say, I really don't know what's going on because what I've heard is from the Pentagon sources here. I haven't been to the region itself, this is what I'm saying, but he broadcast it as if it were the truth. Whereas in reality what happened is that these pathetic Eastern European soldiers, Poles, Ukrainians, Bulgarians, in these barracks in southern Iraqi towns, just think of it. What the hell are the Poles doing in Najaf? Or the Bulgarians in Karbala? What the hell are they doing there? But the one thing they know is not to fight, because they don't want to die, which one can respect. They shouldn't be there in the first place, but they refused to come out onto the streets and take on the Shia, so the US Army had to be sent. People were killed on both sides. The first big clash in Karbala, the holiest city of the Shiite sect within Islam, which indicates that this resistance is not going to go away. Now, the argument which often comes up is, okay, maybe the war was wrong, maybe we shouldn't have gone in, but now that we're there, don't you think we should stay in? Because if we came out, it would be a disaster. But excuse me, it is a disaster because you're in there. Coming out would not be a disaster. Coming out would compel the different factions within Iraq to set up a national government and sort out their own future. That is what is known as national self-determination. But the United States are now so desperate that they're putting pressure on the Turkish army to come in and take the hits. I mean, the most stupid mistake to make, in my opinion. You get the Turks in, you want them to come into the Baghdad region to take the hits so that US soldiers' lives are saved, but the Turks aren't dumb. They want to police the Kurdish region because some of their own Kurds from Turkey have taken refuge there and they want to settle their own accounts. And the Kurds are saying if the Turkish army comes in at all, we might join the resistance. And if the Kurds join the resistance, well, and the Shiites in the south are already preparing for that, then it's endgame. I'm afraid there is no way the United States will be able to control Iraq. Linked to this, and so this big demonstration of imperial power has gone badly wrong. That's the irony. That's what it was intended for, but it's gone wrong. So they cannot invade Syria and Iran. They can encourage the Israelis to go and soften them up with a few bombing raids, but a direct military intervention of Syria or Iran would be suicidal now. It would require introducing the draft in the United States of America in order to do that, because people will stop joining the army. And if they introduce the draft, well, I think the resistance and opposition in this country will quadruple, because people will suddenly say, do we want to go and die there in these wars which this regime, this administration has taken us into? So I think myself, I may be wrong, I hope I'm right, that the planned excursions into Syria and Iran have gone, and if they thought, it's quite interesting, in an off-the-record briefing with 3 senior journalists, Tony Blair, Prime Minister of Britain, still, said, in this briefing, when the journalist said, well, where are the weapons of mass destruction? And Blair said, you don't get it, do you? And they said, excuse us? What do you mean, Prime Minister? And he said, the reason we took Iraq was so that future wars wouldn't be necessary, just the pressure from the West would force regime change. Well, that's not going to happen, is it? The pressure from this botched up occupation of Iraq is going to force regime change in Syria and Iran? I don't think so. I don't think so. In fact, what it's done is completely isolate the West. If you took a vote amongst the populations of that part of the world, a democratic vote, 90% of the population would be against the occupation, not just of Iraq, but of every other country in that world, with the exception of Israel. The one byproduct of this was that the neocon faction in the administration, which is strongly allied to the Likud party in Israel, took advantage of this to settle accounts on behalf of Likud. Ariel Sharon said after the fall of Baghdad to the Palestinians, you Palestinians had better come to your senses because your great protector has gone. Just because Saddam gave some money to the Palestinians, as if that was fueling the struggle, as if the struggle isn't fueled by the basic injustice of what happened in that part of the world many years ago, something which Israeli arrogance still refuses to recognize. That's why that struggle is going on, and it will go on. And as long as the occupation of Iraq and Palestine continues, there will be violence, there will be an increase in terror attacks. It's not going to be very helpful if the real aim was to try and reduce the spread of terror, which they claimed was the real aim. So in this situation, what is to be done here? Get rid of Bush, which is the big argument I hear everywhere I travel in the United States. Well, that would be a start, but what will you get in his place? That's another problem. A four-star general retired, who seems to be the main contender for the Democratic Party. Well, if he were to pull out and he were to say that he would organize a pull-out from Iraq, I would be in favor, but he doesn't say that. Nor do any of the others. They don't say that. They say, yeah, the war was wrong, it was misconceived, we would have done it better. Because what Bush did was he waged war unilaterally, we would have done it multilaterally. But I ask, why would that have made the war correct? If there'd been French and German contingents forming part of the occupation or UN backing, why would that have made the war correct? I just don't understand the logic, and nor do most people. I mean, the notion of a Western community acting on behalf of civilization is a myth. And this is what the late Edward Said, good friend who died recently and whose loss I mourn, together with many others, used to warn us about all the time. In Orientalism and other books, he said that when imperialist suppositions, I paraphrase, but that was his general argument, that when imperialist suppositions are transformed into universal truths for humanity, ideological domination plays a very strong part in it, and therefore Western ideology has to be examined very closely. And he was right. And it's interesting that this one guy who made all these points, I've never seen such a vicious set of obituaries in the LA Times, in the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal, dancing on his grave. Well, it shows he was pretty effective. And it also shows he has many lives ahead of him. If one guy could frighten them so much, just one guy who was never put on the mainstream networks because he was an articulate Palestinian, totally went against the grain of this image of a Palestinian as a terrorist. That's all the United States thinks of the Palestinians. So in this world, I think one cannot depend on politicians to do it. I think change will come, and change will come when movements from below challenge the politicians, and it's always been like that. The big movement which finally brought the Vietnam War to an end, there was a dialectical interrelationship between the struggles of the Vietnamese and the anti-war movement here, and finally US soldiers said, we ain't going to fight anymore. They just said it. And it will probably happen quicker here if the resistance continues on in Iraq. And that's why I think they will be desperate to try and find face-saving solutions. Because the alternatives, even with Iraq, are mass demoralization inside the US Army, because they were taken there under false pretenses, and they can see it. So I appeal to you all, as I do whenever I come to this country, which I do often, because I think what happens in this country is decisive in many ways. And what happens in the anti-war movement and dissenting voices to speak up, not be cowed down. 9/11 was used to try and crush dissent in this country. For months after it, there was, you could only speak the truth in whispers in many campuses and streets. That period has now gone. People are beginning to see how 9/11 was used by this administration for their own purposes, which they don't even try and hide anymore. But this offensive they've waged, this imperial offensive they've waged to protect and preserve their own interests and to defend what they think defend the long-term position of the United States in the world, I mean, this is not going to work, incidentally. All empires are capable of overstretch, especially empires which are not so strong economically. And so there's a lot to play for. There's no reason for gloom and doom and despair. But you have to understand that you have to play your part as alert and vigilant citizens in this country. It's not true that the United States is on the edge of fascism or any nonsense like that, which one hears in some places. It's nonsense. I mean, awful things are being done, and they have to be resisted, and they should be resisted. But one shouldn't sort of completely withdraw inwards. That's all I have to say. Thanks. I'm happy to take questions. So, yeah. Yeah?
Yeah, I was just wondering, what is the state of the anti-war movement in Britain right now?
The anti-war movement in Britain right now is not too different from the anti-war movement in the United States or anywhere else. This was an unusual movement in the sense that you had a massive upsurge before the war commenced. Normally, anti-war movements develop during or in the course of wars. This movement developed before the war, and the reason for that was that large numbers of people who came out genuinely believed, many of them had never participated in any public activity before, leave alone demonstrations. That was what was very noticeable about the movement. That though its organizing core may have been on the left, the bulk of the people who came out weren't. They were ordinary citizens, fed up, angry at being deceived and lied to, and they wanted to stop the war. And when the war went ahead anyway and Iraq was occupied, there was a great deal of demoralization. Anger, alienation, but also demoralization. And people felt, we can't do anything anymore. And now you have a second spurt because of the Iraqi resistance. Demonstrations are beginning again. Blair is being confronted. Your great president is visiting Britain shortly. And at first, the White House wanted a triumphant procession in the usual British carriage with the Queen, driven by white horses through Whitehall. But now they're saying they can't guarantee his security if that happens, because such massive demonstrations are being planned. Then the White House said, well, at least the president will address the House of Commons. This is being negotiated, but the Blair government is nervous because half the Parliamentary Labour Party have said they will walk out. So it will be a helicopter visit where he'll be taken from one side to the other in helicopters in the country in Europe which is his closest ally. And Blair himself is now a hated and despised figure in the country. No one takes him seriously. None of the shows he puts on are taken too seriously. In fact, many people feel he should come and live here. If the administration here could find some work for him, because what he wanted to do was become president of the European Union, but the Europeans won't buy him now. It's second-hand goods. Yeah.
You mentioned a few times that we perceived it to be in our best interest to show a display of military might. How is that in our long-term interest? I don't see us simply saying...
I didn't get your question. Yeah.
I heard you say a number of times that we perceived a show of military might to be in our long-term interests. How so?
Oh, how so? In the sense that there was a very interesting discussion which took place in the administration of Bush Sr. The same personnel, by the way, are involved in this administration, with the exception of Bush Sr. And an Afghan American, very much part of the security advisors, Zalmay Khalilzad, wrote a little pamphlet whose title I forget, but the argument in that pamphlet, written soon after the Gulf War, was the following argument. He said, we no longer have communism, that's gone. We now have a world in which we are dominant, but we have rivals. But what if one of these rivals, he meant competitive rivals, capitalist rivals, what if one of these rivals in the future got out of control and actually challenged US economic hegemony? He didn't talk about challenging military hegemony because that's well nigh impossible. The question is, he's asked, would we use military force to crush such a challenge? And the answer he gave was yes. We have to do it in order to show our future rivals that we're not going to let that happen. And you know, there are think tanks in this country who are constantly thinking of or dreaming of fictional, science fiction projects almost, of how to balkanize China if it gets too big for its boots. Do you go via Taiwan or Tibet? The Chinese are totally aware of this and have their own plans. So this is what I was trying to say to you, that these people do think strategically. All empires have people like that. You know, I'll give you an example just to show you what I mean when I talk about imperial power. When Britain was occupied by the Romans centuries ago, there was an episode recorded by the Roman historian Tacitus in which he was in Britain, where his father-in-law Agricola was the governor of Britain, who in charge of the occupation of Britain. And he recalls in his memoirs of that period, he says on one occasion Tacitus looked in the direction of what we know as Ireland and said, "What are those places?" which lie to the north of Britain. And his advisors replied, these are very backward places inhabited by primitives, they've just boglands, there's nothing worth there, so don't even think about it. Meaning there's nothing of worth economically there, it's irrelevant to us. And Agricola asked, but who occupies it? And he was told, the local people. So he said, it's not under Rome. And they said no. And he said that's very bad, because an unoccupied country sets an example to those who are occupied. And the occupation of Iraq leaves Syria as the only unoccupied country in the region. All the other countries in that particular region are in the pocket of the United States. So that's how they think, even regionally and, more important, globally. The fact that it's going wrong is, interesting, but they didn't imagine it would go wrong. That was what they intended to do. Yeah.
Given that Greater Israel extends from Egypt to the Euphrates, as stated in Genesis, do you think this war on Iraq was launched in order to further Israeli interests?
No, I think, as I pointed out, I think that was a small element in it, that the Israeli regime regarded Iraq as a nuisance and wanted it crushed. I don't think that was the major purpose for it. And I think that any dreams to implement Greater Israel will fail in the medium term, even if they attempt to do it. If you look at what is happening in Israel today, senior members of the Zionist establishment, not people anywhere connected to the peace movement, leave alone the refuseniks who refuse to fight, but senior members of the Zionist establishment. Avraham Burg, chairman of the Knesset till a few years ago, one of the founding fathers, if you like, of the State of Israel, has written an incredibly powerful article, which wasn't published in the American press, but was published in every major European newspaper, as well as in Israel, of course. And in this he said that I feel our own country is teetering on the edge of a big disaster, because we had certain ideals, whatever other people may have thought about them, and we have now totally betrayed our own ideals, leave alone what other people think. And he then goes further, which is quite stunning, by the way. He goes further and he says, if you reduce the Palestinians to the status to which we have reduced them as a state, then why are you surprised when you make their lives so miserable that they want to make our lives miserable in return? And he provides a de facto justification for the suicide bombings. That's why this article created a big shock in Israel. So people inside Israel are beginning to understand that if they carry on occupying the post-67 war territories and carry on harassing and repressing the Palestinians, and no one believes that this is an equal fight. I mean, they could. I mean, you know, what I find most cynical when you debate with Israeli ideologues, which I do regularly, they say, yeah, but okay, you know, more Palestinians have died than Israelis, but you think if we wanted to, we couldn't wipe out all of them. I said, well, let's not go down that road. Of course you could, but what do you think would happen? You think people would just watch it in the region? But so it's a very polarized situation inside Israel itself today, which we have to understand. So to try and occupy other parts of the Arab world, I think will not be acceptable. You know, I think even the United States would be forced to draw back from such a plan, though by and large they go along with them. Yeah.
I'm interested, you know, in the time, I mean, if you can say, in the time of the Cold War, when communism was a real contender in certain countries that were casting off imperialism, you know, if you look at countries like the Congo or in Vietnam, which you mentioned, you know, there could be opposition from America to a popular vote because there was fear of, you know, communism, you know, having popular roots. But in Iraq, what do you think the real fear of the Bush administration is now that they've, you know, quote unquote won? What does the Bush administration fear in having a popular vote or allowing a popular constitution to come about? Are they afraid of an Islamic State, or what are they afraid of?
Oh, well, I mean, you know, if you look at it, here you come to what happens in countries like this. It is a very rich, oil-rich state. And in oil-rich countries, historically, both the British Empire and the American Empire do not like democratically elected governments. Because if your country is rich in oil, a democratically elected government wants to preserve control of that oil and use it for its own purposes, whatever they may be. This is not in the interest of the empire, you know, and it's got nothing to do with democracy or human rights. A year before they invaded Iraq, exactly a year before that, they tried to topple the government of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. He was not just elected once, he had been elected 6 different times by the people of Venezuela. He had pushed through the most democratic constitution in Latin America, yet they tried to topple him. Why? Because he was trying to break the stranglehold of a corrupt group of people over the oil industry in order to use the oil money for providing elementary human resources for the poor: shelter, school, health, education. Basic social democratic demands which were acceptable in the old days to virtually everyone, including the United States, not acceptable now in this epoch. So they tried to topple him. And an elected government in Iraq, if it was a genuine election, what if it said, the first thing it demanded was the exit of all occupation soldiers, not a single foreign army on our soil. The second thing it demanded was Iraqi control over Iraqi oil, saying this would be state-controlled. What would they do? They'd have to push through another regime change very, very quickly, and it would backfire. And what if they went beyond that and said, the bulk of our population shares a great deal in common with the bulk of the Iranians, both in terms of oil resources and our needs and religion and culture, and we want a joint security pact with Iran and a common agreement on economic, political, social matters. How would that be greeted? It would create an absolutely giant state in the region, even if they didn't unite. Not in the interest of the United States. So the only democracy they will permit will be, if they do any at all, it will be strictly controlled, just like the British did it. The British organized an election when they controlled Iraq. 2/3 of the seats were uncontested. All the landlords won, which is why people have a genuine contempt for this style of democracy as well. Yeah.
After the war, even more so than before, it became very obvious that Saddam was a brutal murderer of his own people.
Sorry?
Saddam was a brutal dictator and murdered his own people. Would you admit that on any level, it's a good thing that he was removed from power?
I think people of the country should have they are the only people who have the right to remove their dictators. As I pointed out, the bulk of the repression, that's why they couldn't show any images of this. The bulk of the repression took place in the 80s, throughout that decade, when he was a very close ally of your government and the West. When he was a close ally, they were dealing with him economically, arming him. His scientists, his military were being trained in the academy in Britain, for a start. Why didn't they use the influence they had with him to pressure him at that time, saying, don't do this, it's not good? They didn't do it. That was the time they could have done it. If they were genuinely interested, that's when the bulk of the repression took place, not over the last 5 years. So,
regardless of the reasons.
Sorry?
Regardless of the reasons why.
Yeah, but it's pointless invading a country when you create a bigger mess than existed before. There are now more prisoners in Iraq than there were under the last years of the Saddam regime. More people have been locked up in prison. It's for many people, and the punishments they're inflicting on people they suspect of being in the resistance are brutal. You attack their families, you lock them up, you destroy their homes. We've seen the evidence for it. It's classic colonial occupation from that point of view. And that's why they're nervous. There are very few actual Iraqis that they trust, not even to clean the US Army barracks. Imported South Asian and Filipino immigrants to do that. Yeah.
You mentioned at the beginning of your talk about two factors. One, allowing pullback to the 67 border, as well as the autonomy of a Palestinian state as being very, very crucial, as well as pulling out of Iraq.
Yeah.
Now, given that, in a way, there's been so much damage, do you have any further suggestions about political maneuvers now that may be helpful? One, to stop the sort of generative sort of terrorism that's going on, sort of moving into certain organizations of the young, things like that. So in other words, political situations before are very different than what they're going to be now. Do you have some suggestions?
Well, I think the only suggestion one can make is to repeat what one said. The United States has phenomenal pressure it could exercise on Israel. Not military pressure, political, economic, to pull them back. They could do it, but they don't want to do it. And this regime, like the Clinton regime, is packed with partisans of Israel. So in this recent election campaign, Howard Dean says once we should be even-handed to the Palestinians and the Israelis, even-handed when one's occupying someone else's lands and state. But even that is unacceptable, and he's forced to retreat on that very, very quickly. And if this is the atmosphere, then it's unlikely that they will do anything on Israel. As far as Iraq is concerned, you now have a full, a sort of first-stage resistance struggle, as I pointed out, which is different from terrorism. It's not terrorism. Basically, they're trying to get the occupation armies out of their country. Everyone whose countries have been occupied have used these tactics. The Europeans used them against the fascists in Italy, in France. The resistance movements did many of these things, including blowing up cafes where occupation soldiers were sitting. The Algerians did it in France. And the Iraqis will do it in Iraq. That's not a big surprise. And I think there were, the interesting thing is the other thing which I didn't talk about. It's only in this country that a large chunk of the population believed that Saddam Hussein had links with Al-Qaeda. No one anywhere else in the world believes this, and the politicians elsewhere in the world don't even want to try it on because the populations are better informed, and the politicians know people will laugh. But here, Bush got away with it and still repeats this nonsense. It's a total and complete nonsense. So it was the weapons of mass destruction and the Al-Qaeda link that were the main excuse is used to go to war. It wasn't Saddam's repression. This wasn't designated as a humanitarian intervention, but as a preemptive strike and self-defense. That's how they characterized it to get around the UN Charter and international law, but that's now been proved to be a total joke. So in fact, there is a prima facie case, a real legally. Senior attorneys in Britain say that there is a prima facie case to try Bush and Blair at the International War Crimes Court. Of course, they can't be tried because of who they are, but there is a case. Yeah.
Will you agree with, I know you're talking a lot about the motivations for getting Iraq. Would you agree that one motivation might be to just create an artificial ally in a hostile region, sort of like what happened with Kuwait in the wake of the night of the first Gulf War?
First Gulf War, you mean? Or did you say the first? Yeah. Well, I think obviously occupying it, that was also, and I don't think that was the main motivation. The main motivation is as I described it. But a subsidiary plan was to create an Iraq state which they could use rather than being over-dependent on Saudi Arabia. But that's not going to work. You know, this is where they made a very big mistake in going for Iraq. They thought that the population would rise and greet them as liberators. And that's not going to happen. Yeah, let's have one last question. Yeah.
I disagree with you on some things and agree with you on others. I used to be a
Fair
Foreign
enough.
Service officer.
Sorry?
I used to be a Foreign Service officer in the Office of UN Political and Security Affairs.
You have?
State
Yeah.
Department, and I worked on UNAF and Middle Eastern problems. First, let me tell you some of the things I agree with. When Theodore Herzl went to Palestine, he didn't notice that there were other people already living there for 2,000 years. This is a fundamental problem. One of my Jewish PhD colleagues at the State Department said the problem is almost insoluble because you've got two parties who believe that God promised them the same piece of territory. Third, I never thought, after taking courses on fascism and dictatorships in graduate school in Ann Arbor, I would see somebody applying Dr. Goebbels' theories of propaganda, but it's being used brilliantly by this current administration. His theory was tell no small lies, nobody will believe you. You have to tell whoppers, really big ones, and persist in it. And sometimes you can notice when President Bush tells a really big whopper, there is a unique glint in his eyes. Also, the thing is that the Palestinians have always been used as a wedge against Israel by the other Arab countries. They don't give a damn about the Palestinians. They have never given a penny, not a penny, to the relief fund that takes care of the people in those camps. The United States has always paid 78% of them. And they are opposed to Israel because this is a modern, technological, democratic society in the midst of a lot of totalitarian states. And I think we've got to do something, and I don't know how we're going to or if we ever will, about the Wahhabism and the madrasa schools which are spreading all of these distorted feelings about the nature of Islam, because Islam at one time was a very leading civilized country or movement. It had people from Christianity and Judaism in all of its universities. It did not treat women as property of men, and they've been dead for 600 years, which is too bad. And the idea that you can go backwards instead of forwards, I think, is very counterproductive to their own long-term future. Also,
can I answer you?
Yes, let me give you one more thing. The A-bomb was not used in Japan, although revisionists think so, to warn the Russians and so on. If you read the official World War II histories of the Army, they were anticipating between 2 and 3 million American dead in the occupation of Japan. And they estimated that at least 6 million Japanese were going to die. And General MacArthur kept pushing General Marshall to get the Russians into the war, otherwise he said he wouldn't command the American forces there. And we actually cinderized a hell of a lot more people in our firebombing of Tokyo than were killed in the 2 nuclear weapons.
Okay, well, I mean, we can agree to disagree on that. There's a big discussion which goes on endlessly about the reason why the nuclear weapons were used in Japan. I think when you say that there was talk that the Russians had declared war on Japan, it's precisely to prevent the Russians from coming in to share in that country and occupy together with the United States, i.e. the so-called communist threat, which began even before the Second World War was over, played a major part in the use of those weapons. It's a different way of putting it. As far as Israel and the Arab world is concerned, I think most of the Arab world accepts that Israel is there to stay. It is a colonial settler state, but with a difference in the sense that the bulk of that population has no mother state to return to, as was the case in previous colonial empires. Doesn't justify what happened, but they're prepared to accept it, provided that the Israelis accept that what they did to the Palestinians in 1948 was a dreadful crime. Uprooting them from their villages, destroying their villages, driving them out, and providing some compensation to the families who've lost homes and property there. But they don't even begin to say that. Instead, they constantly demonize the Palestinians. But the second part of that is that we have to have a Palestinian state with continuous territory, with its own borders, with its own rights, without Israeli settlers, without Israeli tanks permanently overlooking Palestinian towns. In other words, a proper Palestinian state which is not an Israeli protectorate. That's the key. If that were done, I think it would lay the basis for coexistence in the future, because as you point out yourself, and you're right, historically, even though many hardcore Israelis like Netanyahu Sr. constantly try to find stories of permanent victimization of the Jewish people, there have been periods in history where coexistence took place and there was very little or no repression. The period in Islamic Spain, where the Muslims were the ruling class in Spain, was a period where Jews were treated like anyone else and rose to high positions within the structures of that state. When the barbarian crusaders from Europe went and occupied the Arab lands, took Jerusalem, destroyed synagogues and the temple, burnt Jews alive, burnt Muslims alive, the Muslim leader who took Jerusalem back and made it a free city for all three religions, gave state subsidies for the synagogues to be built, was an Arab leader called Salahuddin. So historically, these two religions have not been engaged in wars against each other for hundreds of years. They've worked with each other. What changed that was a political thing, not ethnic, not religious. Well, a political decision to create the State of Israel, which wouldn't have happened without the total support in the crucial period, not the later period, crucial support of the British Empire and the Balfour Declaration of 1917, which said that they could create a state there. Many, many very decent Jewish thinkers argued for a cultural presence in the Middle East. They said we shouldn't have a political presence because, and many far-sighted thinkers said, if we establish a political presence in the Middle East, it will force us to become oppressors. We should have a cultural presence and live with the people who are already here. This was, of course, rejected by the Zionists. And all I say to you is this, that the horrible Judeocide of the Second World War left its mark on Europe, but it also created indirect victims who are the Palestinians who are paying the price. So, thank you.